A forgotten World War I bicycle suddenly vanishes from a quiet English village, and Miss Marple is drawn into a mystery where memory, sacrifice, and truth come back to life. Welcome to the series of Driftaway Tales. I am your host, Ilyas. If you are interested in fictional historical tales of this channel, please like this video and subscribe this channel. Chapter 1. A Bicycle That Should Not Move. St. Mary Mead woke slowly, as it always did. First came the soft stirring of leaves, then the faint clatter of milk bottles. Then, as the sun rose behind the cottages, the familiar quiet settled over the village like an old quilt. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you, Miss Marple," he began, voice rough with anxiety, "but something strange has happened. I can't explain it." Miss Marple's expression softened. "Please come in, Major. Sit down. Start from the beginning." The Major entered, pacing before settling into the chair opposite her. "It's my grandfather's bicycle," he finally said. "A bicycle?" Miss Marple raised a brow gently. "Not just any bicycle," he added with a deep breath. "A 1914 military bicycle. From the Great War. Solid steel frame, anti-bullet rubber tires, rifle mount still fixed to the bar. It belonged to Corporal Henry Collins, my grandfather." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "And what has happened to it?" "It has vanished," Major Collins whispered, completely, silently, impossibly. Miss Marple's cup paused just before her lips. "Something that vanishes silently often has the loudest story." Major Collins led Miss Marple to the far edge of his garden, where a small shed stood under the shade of an old chestnut tree. The shed door hung open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the mild scent of rust, yet an unnatural stillness, made it feel as though something had been forcibly removed from the heart of the room. The Major pointed at the floor helplessly. There were no footprints. None at all. Miss Marple crouched slowly, examining the shed's wooden boards. The dust lay evenly except for a long, sharp line where something heavy had rested for decades. "The bicycle stood here?" she asked. "Yes, right there. I locked the shed last night. This morning the lock was intact. The dust looked untouched. And yet, everything is gone." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with quiet knowing. Locks that remain intact are contradictory things. They either tell the truth, or they tell what someone once heard. She placed her fingers gently along the wall, feeling thin scratches barely visible to the eye. Vertical scratches. "Major," she said softly, "your bicycle was not rolled out." The Major blinked. "Not rolled? No." Her voice was calm, steady. "It was lifted." He stared at her in disbelief. "Lifted? By whom?" "It weighs nearly 30 kilograms." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She was watching something on the ground near the wall, a tiny streak of rust on the white exterior, left by metal brushing against it in a hurry, left by hands that were not careless, merely desperate. She straightened slowly. "Tell me, Major, who besides you knew the bicycle existed?" The Major swallowed. "No one," he whispered. "At least?" "I believe that." Miss Marple asked to see the last known condition of the bicycle, and Major Collins brought out an old photograph. It showed a young soldier standing proudly beside the military-issue bicycle during the early days of World War I. The bicycle looked heavy, purposeful, and strangely elegant with its solid anti-puncture tires and a rifle fitted across the frame like a silent guardian. Miss Marple studied the picture with her usual stillness. "This machine is not merely metal," she murmured. "It carries memory, history, loyalty, even grief." The Major nodded slowly. "My grandfather relied on it for deliveries during the war. It carried letters, medical supplies, even wounded soldiers. He always said the bicycle saved more lives than it ever carried. Miss Marple's eyes drifted back to the open shed door. A relic like that does not simply disappear. Someone took it knowing its value, not monetary, but emotional. He handed her another object, a rusted badge. It fell on the shed floor. It wasn't there before. Miss Marple turned it over in her palm. The symbol was faint, but still readable. BEF 1914, British Expeditionary Forces. Her heartbeat slowed. A puzzle piece slipped quietly into place. "Major," she said with a softness that hinted at deeper thought, "someone with a connection to your grandfather or the war has touched this bicycle recently." He frowned. "But who from that time is even alive?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She rarely did until she knew the whole shape of the truth. Instead, she offered, "Let us look outside the shed. Darkness often hides what daylight reveals." Outside, the morning sun fell gently on the narrow path that led through the Major's garden toward the quiet village lane. Gravel crunched softly under Miss Marple's shoes as she walked, but she noticed immediately that the gravel near the shed's threshold had an unusual pattern. It was pushed inward, not outward. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "As I thought." The Major blinked in confusion. "What does that mean?" "It means," she replied, "the bicycle did not exit through the shed door. It was lifted out, carried, not rolled. Someone wanted to avoid tracks. But who would have the strength?" Miss Marple remained silent, eyes drifting toward the distant rooftops of St. Mary Mead. Something subtle had caught her attention, a faint bend in the hedge near the garden gate where someone had brushed past. She approached it, fingertips tracing the leaves gently. There, almost invisible, was a single short strand of worn wool, military gray. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "There is your first real clue." The Major stared at it, startled. "Wool? From what?" Miss Marple answered softly. "From a very old coat. The kind issued during the Great War." Miss Marple stepped onto the village lane, letting her eyes adjust to the soft haze of morning light. The peaceful road curved gently toward the heart of St. Mary Mead, but she wasn't looking at the road. She was looking at the grass beyond it. There, a small cluster of wildflowers had been crushed, not trampled, but pressed by something long and heavy. A bicycle frame, carried awkwardly by someone who struggled with its weight. The Major followed her gaze, breath-catching. "Do you mean to say someone walked away carrying the entire bicycle?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "and whoever it was walked that way." She pointed toward the railway line at the edge of the village, the old abandoned hut barely visible through the morning mist. Her voice was soft, but filled with certainty. "Your bicycle was not stolen for greed. It was taken for remembrance." She took a slow breath. "And memories, Major, have a way of returning to where they began." She turned toward the distant railway hut, the first destination in a mystery that had only just spoken its first syllable. "Come," she said. "We must follow the past before it disappears again." Chapter 2. The Soldier's Shadow. Miss Marple and Major Collins walked side by side through the quiet village lane. The morning sun touched the rooftops with a muted gold, softening the edges of every house. A few villagers waved politely. Others cast curious glances at the unusually serious expressions of the pair. But no one stopped them. St. Mary Mead had learned long ago that when Miss Marple walked with purpose, something important was unfolding. Major Collins clutched the old photograph of the bicycle in his hand. His thumb nervously traced the edges of the image as they walked. "Miss Marple," he began hesitantly, "you said earlier that the person who took the bicycle is connected to my grandfather. But who could that be?" Nearly everyone from that time is gone. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, many are gone. But not all, Major, and memories have long shadows, sometimes longer than a lifetime. He looked puzzled not for the last time. Miss Marple continued. People rarely disturb the past without reason. A relic as specific as your grandfather's bicycle is not taken by chance. It is taken by someone who remembers, or someone who wishes to remember. The Major stared at the photograph again. My grandfather never spoke much of the war. All I know is that he served in France in 1914 and that he saved a man once, someone he never named. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. A man he saved? Yes, he mentioned it only once. Said he carried him for miles, said the bicycle was the only reason he managed. Miss Marple's steps slowed just a little. Oh dear, she murmured softly. That is not a small detail, Major. A life saved is a life bound. The Major frowned, unsure of what she meant. But she did not explain that yet. They reached the turn that led toward the railway line. Behind them, the village carried on in its usual quiet rhythm, unaware that a small piece of history had begun to stir again. The path narrowing toward the abandoned railway was lined with tall grass and wild flowers. In the still morning air, every broken stem and crushed leaf told its own tale. Miss Marple knelt carefully near the first disturbance. "Observe, Major," she said gently. "These stalks are pressed down sideways, not snapped. That means the weight came from something dragged or rested intermittently." "Dragged?" he echoed. "But I thought you said the bicycle was lifted?" "And it was," Miss Marple replied. "But no one carries such weight without pause." She pointed to a deeper imprint in the grass, an odd shape, wide at one end and narrow at the other. "That is the mark of a bicycle frame," she explained. "And this," she traced another unusual indentation, "belongs to the leather pouch you described." The Major leaned closer, amazed by how much she had seen. "How did you notice all this?" he asked. Miss Marple gave a small smile. "When one spends a lifetime observing the tiny misbehaviors of roses, hedges, and mischievous neighborhood cats, one learns to read the ground quite well." As they followed the trail further, the patterns changed. The grass became uneven, the marks closer together. "He became tired," Miss Marple murmured. "Whoever carried it, he struggled here." The Major felt a flicker of sympathy. A thief who gets tired? That seems unusual. "Not a thief," Miss Marple corrected softly. "Someone older. Someone who has not carried such weight for many years. Someone driven more by emotion than strength." The Major inhaled slowly. An elderly man from the war, carrying the bicycle. A strange discomfort settled in his chest. They walked on, and soon the path ended at the edge of the old railway track. Ahead stood the abandoned railway hut, its wooden walls gray with age, its door hanging crookly, as if time itself had sighed and leaned against it. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Now we see what memory has sought to reclaim. The hut had clearly not been used for years. Ivy clung to its walls, and dust floated inside like tiny ghosts suspended in still air. Yet despite its forgotten appearance, something felt wrong, too disturbed, too recently touched. Miss Marple stepped inside first, her shoes barely making a sound on the wooden boards. The Major followed, the hut groaning under the weight of his footsteps. Immediately, Miss Marple stopped. "Do not move, Major," she whispered. On the floor, in a narrow strip of dust, lay a perfectly clean set of marks, not footprints, but the shape of a large circular object pressed carefully down. "The front wheel," Miss Marple concluded. The Major knelt, stunned. "It's here?" Miss Marple nodded. "He brought the bicycle in pieces." Her eyes then shifted toward the corner of the hut, where a faint glimmer caught her attention. She leaned down and picked up something small, metallic, and cold. A spent candle stub. Candle wax fresh, not older than a night. The Major's voice trembled. Someone stayed here. Miss Marple's expression deepened. Not stayed, Major, just rested. This place was a pause in his journey, not the destination. She scanned the walls and spotted something else. A torn envelope, half buried under dust. Carefully she pulled it free. The writing was shaky, uncertain, and decades old, but the words were clear. To the son of Henry Collins, for the truth. The Major felt his breath catch in his throat. My grandfather's name, he whispered. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment as if listening to the quiet murmurs of a long-suppressed memory. The bicycle was not taken for theft, she said softly. It was taken to deliver a message. She placed the envelope in the Major's hands. Someone has carried a truth for too long. Miss Marple moved slowly around the hut, examining every corner. Her fingers brushed over a shelf where dust had been disturbed. Someone had steadied themselves here. She noticed a faint indentation on the floor where a knee might have pressed. An old man knelt here, she murmured, perhaps to gather strength, perhaps to pray. The Major sighed heavily. But who? Who would go through all this trouble? And why not simply come to me? Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Shame keeps people silent, Major. So does gratitude and guilt. Often, people approaching their final years feel compelled to settle their debts with the past, to return what they owe, or to ask forgiveness. She paused at the hut's broken window, its frame covered in dust, except for a small area that had been wiped clean. He looked outside, she said softly, toward the next place he needed to go. The Major joined her at the window, peering out at the quiet stretch of land leading toward the churchyard. What would he seek there? He asked. Miss Marple turned the envelope over in her hands. A grave, she replied, or the memory of a man he lost, or a man he owes his life to. The Major's throat tightened. My grandfather, he saved someone in the war, but he never told us who. Miss Marple touched his arm gently. Some wounds heal only in silence, Major, and some debts remain unpaid until a man's last breath. They stepped out of the hut into the soft light that filtered through the trees. The wind had begun to pick up, brushing cool fingers through the tall grass. Miss Marple looked down and found another trail faint, but still visible. Footprints. Slow, dragging, the gait uneven. An elderly man, with a heavy burden, she whispered. He left the hut at dawn. But where would he go? The Major asked. Miss Marple pointed her cane toward the distant spire of St. Mary Mead's church. To the place where truth is kept safe, she said quietly. To the churchyard. The Major felt the air thicken with emotion. Do you mean he brought the bicycle there? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, because someone buried in that place meant something to him, perhaps everything. She began walking again, each step steady, certain. There is a story your grandfather never told, a story someone else has carried for half a century. She looked at the Major, eyes soft yet piercing. And now, Major, it is time to hear it. They walked toward the churchyard path, unaware that the next revelation would shake the very foundation of the Collins family history. Chapter 3. The Girl Who Saw the Strange Man. As Miss Marple and Major Collins approached the heart of St. Mary Mead, the village atmosphere remained deceptively peaceful. The warm sunlight, the crisp wind brushing the hedgerows, and the occasional chirp of a sparrow all seemed to insist that nothing unusual could ever happen here. But Miss Marple knew better. St. Mary Mead was a polite village, but beneath its quiet surfaces lived stories, some whispered, some buried, and some waiting to return. They stopped near the bakery, where the smell of warm bread mingled with the scent of morning dew. Lily Thompson, the baker's young daughter, stood behind the small counter, arranging fresh buns. Her bright face lit up when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, good morning, Miss Marple and Major Collins," she said, though her eyes darted anxiously between them. Miss Marple approached with her gentle, reassuring smile. "My dear, we won't trouble you long. We simply need to ask if you noticed anything unusual last night." Lily hesitated. Miss Marple didn't push. She simply folded her hands and waited with the sort of silence that quietly invites truth. Finally, Lily exhaled. "Well, yes, I did see something, or someone." The Major leaned forward. "What exactly?" Lily swallowed. "I was closing the shop at around 10. The moon was very bright, and I saw a man walking down the lane." "A man?" Miss Marple repeated. "Alone?" "Yes, miss. But he was carrying something big on his shoulder." She mimed the action, both hands gripping an invisible weight above her. "What sort of shape?" Miss Marple asked. "Round, like a wheel." Lily lowered her voice. "But it wasn't a normal bicycle wheel. It looked old, rusty." The Major stiffened. "That's him," he whispered. Lily continued. "He was tall, but his walk was slow, heavy, like he was tired or hurt." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did he look frightened, Lily?" The girl nodded, surprised. "Yes, very frightened, miss. Like he was carrying something he didn't want anyone to see." When they stepped outside the bakery, Miss Marple paused near the lane's edge. There, beyond the cobblestones, grew a line of tall grass that bordered the road. She carefully examined the blades, quiet, patient, and deliberate. "There," she whispered, pointing. The Major followed her gaze and saw the faintest sign of disturbance. Wildflowers crushed in a gentle curve, grass bent from weight passing through. "How can you even see that?" the Major asked, baffled. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Because disturbed things rarely know how to hide their own distress, even grass." She walked along the trail, noting every shift and break. The Major kept pace, though slower, his mind struggling to piece together what she was easily reading. After several minutes, Miss Marple stopped near a wooden fence at the far end of the lane. "Do you see this mark?" she asked. A thin smear of reddish-brown metal residue streaked across the top of the fence, as though something heavy had brushed over it. "Rust," she declared. From an old wheel, the Major stared at the trail. "So he came this way?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and not quickly. See how the footprints are uneven. He carried the wheel with great difficulty." Major Collins exhaled shakily. "But why only the wheel? What about the rest of the bicycle?" Miss Marple glanced ahead, toward the path leading deeper into the meadow. "The rest was likely carried separately," she said calmly. And not far behind, they followed the grass path until it opened into a wide meadow behind the village. The wind swept gently across the tall blades, creating waves that shimmered in the sunlight. Despite the beauty of the scene, something felt broken in the landscape. Miss Marple knelt again, touching a patch of flattened grass. "Here," she murmured. He set it down. The Major knelt beside her. "How can you tell?" "Because the shape is different, a wider depression. This is where he rested the bicycle frame, and look 2 smaller marks beside it from the leather pouch hanging on the side." The Major inspected the impressions, awe mixing with fear. "He must have been exhausted," he whispered. Miss Marple nodded sadly. "Older bones tire quickly, and memories are heavier than steel." As she stood, something else caught her attention, a scrap of fabric tangled among the grass stems. She carefully lifted it. A piece of wool, gray, worn thin with age. The Major inhaled sharply. "Miss Marple, that looks like—" "A fragment of a military coat," she finished softly. the type worn by soldiers of the 1914 British Expeditionary Forces. The Major paled. Then it must be someone from my grandfather's regiment. Miss Marple placed the wool in her handkerchief. Yes, someone who has kept that coat for decades. She looked toward the distant trees bordering the meadow, and someone who walked this way last night with purpose and fear. The Major's voice shook. What could he be afraid of? Time, Miss Marple replied quietly. And truth. At the meadow's edge lived Mrs. Harwood, an elderly woman known for her sharp eyes and even sharper memory. Miss Marple approached her small cottage, and the old woman opened the door before they could even knock. Miss Marple, she greeted. I suppose this visit has to do with the fellow I saw limping across the meadow last night? The Major nearly jumped. You saw him? Mrs. Harwood adjusted her spectacles. Oh, yes, couldn't sleep, so I sat by the window. There he was, tall man, coat flapping about like a ghost, struggling under some heavy contraption. Did you recognize him? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Harwood frowned deeply. Not his face. Too dark, but his walk. Oh, I've seen that limp before. The Major leaned in. Whose limp? She thought for a moment. Well, reminds me of old Arthur Penbury. Major Collins blinked. Arthur Penbury? But he moved away years ago. Yes, Mrs. Harwood sighed. But I heard he returned recently, quietly. Doesn't tell anyone. Lives in that little abandoned carriage near the old railway. Poor soul, they say he never recovered from the war. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with the Major. Arthur Penbury. A name whispered only in fragments in the Collins family. A soldier who served in the same regiment as Henry Collins. A man who vanished from the world after 1914. Miss Marple spoke softly. Mrs. Harwood, did the man look frightened? Oh, yes, she whispered, like he was running from the past, or carrying it. When they left the cottage, the Major felt dizzy with revelation. Miss Marple? Arthur Penbury? Could he be the man my grandfather saved? Miss Marple began walking back toward the railway track, her steps steady and calm. Perhaps, she said, or perhaps he is the man who owes your grandfather a truth he never told. But why take the bicycle? The Major insisted. Why carry it across the entire village? Miss Marple stopped at the edge of the meadow, looking toward the distant railway hut, the place where the trail began and where it now clearly led again. Because, she replied softly, the bicycle was not merely an object to him. It was the last remaining witness of the moment that bound your grandfather's life to his. She looked up at the clouds drifting slowly across the sky. He carried the bicycle because he could no longer carry the memory alone. The Major swallowed hard. What do we do now? Miss Marple turned toward the railway line, the path that led to the old abandoned carriage where Arthur Penbury was rumored to be living. We follow the truth, she said simply, and we find the man who has been running from it for 50 years. Chapter 4, The Railway Hut That Remembers. Miss Marple and Major Collins reached the far edge of the village, where the tall grass grew wild, and the land became quiet enough for one's thoughts to echo. Ahead of them lay the long disused railway line, its tracks rusted, its sleepers half swallowed by earth and weeds. Nothing had run on this line in 20 years. It was a place where silence lingered as though guarding something fragile. The air held the scent of damp earth, old timber, and forgotten journeys. The hut stood a short distance ahead, small, wooden, leaning slightly, as if time had placed a tired hand upon it. Its window was cracked, its door ajar, its roof bearing the scars of many winters. Yet something about it felt recently awakened. Miss Marple sensed it the moment they stepped nearer. "Major," she said quietly, "you must remember that abandoned places do not always stay abandoned. Sometimes memories find their way back. The Major nodded, though confusion still furrowed his brow. I cannot imagine why an old soldier would return to such a place. Miss Marple gave a gentle, knowing smile. When a man carries a burden for 50 years, he eventually searches for somewhere quiet to set it down. They reached the hut, and as Miss Marple touched the door frame, she felt the faint ripple of something, an emotion left behind, like the echo of a sigh. The inside of the railway hut was dim, its walls lined with faint marks of railway days long past. Hooks where lanterns once hung, shelves where tickets and timetables had gathered dust. But now something new had carved itself into this aging memory. Miss Marple stopped just inside the door. "Do you smell it, Major?" she asked softly. The Major inhaled, then blinked. "Candle. An oil? Fresh?" "Yes." Miss Marple stepped further in. "Someone has spent time here recently, very recently." Her sharp eyes scanned the room, collecting details the way a bird gathers twigs. A candle stub on the floor, wax still soft. A tin mug, wiped clean, but not perfectly. Footprints light, careful, dragging slightly. And in the far corner, leaning against the wall, the unmistakable circular shadow print where a wheel had rested. Miss Marple knelt. "He placed the wheel here. The angle suggests he removed it from his shoulder with great difficulty." The Major swallowed, overwhelmed by the pieces fitting together. Miss Marple, how could he walk so far? He must be quite old now. "Yes," she said quietly, and determined. She moved toward the hut's small window. Dust coated the sill except for one half-moon shape, as though a hand had wiped it clean to peer outside. "A man looking outward," she murmured, thinking, hesitating, deciding his next step. The Major's throat tightened. What step would that be? Miss Marple turned, her expression soft and grave. "To deliver a truth your grandfather left unfinished." Near the shelf, half buried in dust, lay the torn envelope Miss Marple had spotted earlier. She lifted it delicately, careful not to tear it further. It felt brittle, fragile, like something carried close to the heart for decades. The Major leaned in. "Is that—" Miss Marple brushed the dust from the surface. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but unmistakably sincere. Across the front, "To the son of Henry Collins, for the truth." The Major's breath caught. "Why write to me? What truth? My grandfather never spoke of anything hidden." Miss Marple traced the lettering gently with her thumb. "People who endure war often choose silence afterward," she said softly. "And sometimes their silence becomes another man's burden." She opened the envelope carefully, but it was empty. The Major blinked. "What? The letter is gone?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "It was never placed inside." She turned the envelope over, showing the faint imprint of a fold. "This was prepared years ago," she said, "but the writer never found the courage to finish it." The Major stared at it as though holding a ghost. "Then why bring it now?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "the writer believes he has little time left." Miss Marple moved to the far wall of the hut, where a faint marking glimmered under the dust. She brushed it lightly with her glove. It was a small, purposeful carving, just 2 lines and a curve, but she knew what it meant the moment she saw it. "The King's shilling mark," she whispered. The Major frowned. "I've heard of it." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Many soldiers carved this into their belongings or walls before leaving for France. It represented loyalty, brotherhood, a promise to return." She stepped back, studying the mark thoughtfully. "This was carved long ago," she said, "but the dust around it has been recently disturbed. Someone touched it. Recently, with reverence." The Major felt a lump in his throat. "Perhaps remembering my grandfather, or honoring him," Miss Marple said. She examined the mark more closely. There were scratches, new ones, beneath the old carving. A shaking hand had traced the symbol again, as though renewing a vow. "Whoever came here," she murmured, "has been carrying the memory of Henry Collins for half a century." The Major's voice was barely a whisper. "So it is Arthur Penberry." "Almost certainly," Miss Marple said, "but we must be sure." She looked at the floor. A faint, uneven trail of footprints, 1 foot strong, the other dragging, led toward the door, and beyond the door, toward the churchyard. When they stepped outside the hut once more, the light had changed. Thin clouds drifted across the sky, softening the sun. The air felt heavier, filled with the weight of something waiting just ahead. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, letting the wind carry its quiet message to her ears. "A man nearing the end of his life," she murmured, "does not move without purpose. He brings with him what he cannot leave behind." The Major looked toward the church spire rising gently above the trees. Why would he go there? "For the same reason the railway hut was chosen," Miss Marple answered. "For silence, for memory, for peace." She began walking along the narrow path that wound toward the churchyard. The Major followed, each footstep echoing deeper into the past. As they neared the boundary stones, Miss Marple paused. The wind stirred once more, cooler now, almost solemn. A faint rustling sound drifted from the graveyard like the shifting of someone seated on the ground. Miss Marple's eyes soft. "Major," she whispered, "prepare yourself." He swallowed hard. "For what?" She stepped forward, voice quiet but certain. "For the man who has been waiting 50 years to speak the truth your grandfather could not." And together they walked into the churchyard, toward the revelation waiting among the stones. Chapter 5. The Man at the Graveyard. The churchyard of St. Mary Mead held an ancient kind of silence, one that felt neither lonely nor cold, but full of stories carefully folded into the earth. The gravestones stood like gentle old sentinels, watching over decades of lives lived and lost. Miss Marple stepped through the iron gate, the hinges releasing a soft sigh. Major Collins followed her, breath shallow, nerves braced. He scanned the rows of gravestones, expecting someone to rise or flee at the sound of their arrival, but no one did. It was Miss Marple who first noticed him sitting near the far corner beneath the yew tree. An elderly man hunched forward, hands resting on something beside him. As the wind brushed the branches, shadows wavered across his shoulders like thin, trembling wings. "Major," Miss Marple whispered, "there he is." They approached slowly, careful not to startle him. When they drew close enough, the Major saw what the old man's trembling hands rested upon. A piece of the missing bicycle frame, old, rusted, but dearly protected. The rest of the bicycle lay nearby, propped against the gravestone, almost reverently. The rifle mount caught a weak glint of light. The pedal hung still like a suspended heartbeat. The old man did not react until Miss Marple spoke softly. "Mr. Penberry." His shoulders stiffened. His head lifted slightly, though he did not turn to face them. "You've come," he murmured. "I wondered if I had enough time left for you to find me." The Major's throat closed. You know who I am?" he asked. Arthur Penberry nodded slowly. "Of course. You're Henry Collins's boy." Arthur Penberry turned at last, revealing a face carved by years of suffering and wandering. His eyes were pale, tired, but deeply human, holding a sorrow that felt too heavy for one man alone. "I always meant to speak to you, lad," he said quietly. "But life had other plans." The Major sat beside him, stunned. "Mr. Penberry, why did you take the bicycle?" Arthur smiled sadly. "I didn't steal it. I borrowed it, for one night, to bring it here to the man who should never have been, buried without his story told." He rested his hand gently on the gravestone behind him, its lettering worn almost smooth. Miss Marple read the faint name, Henry Collins, the Major's grandfather. The old man inhaled deeply. "Your grandfather saved my life, Major. In France, 1914, I was shot in the leg." He touched his limp lightly, "and left behind when the retreat sounded. Too much gunfire, too much chaos. Men falling like wheat." He closed his eyes briefly, the memory washing over him like a cold wave. "But Henry, your grandfather, he came back for me." The Major raised a trembling hand to his mouth. Arthur continued in a soft, broken voice. "He carried me, lifted me onto his bicycle, his pride, that old machine, and he pedaled through mud and bullets. I begged him to leave me, but he wouldn't. He said, 'If this bicycle can carry water and letters, it can carry a man.' His voice shivered. He lost half his rations, destroyed his boots, ruined his bicycle frame. But he saved me." Miss Marple watched Arthur Penbury with profound gentleness. She could see the weight of years pressing against him, every memory pulling at his fragile frame. "I promised him," Arthur whispered, "that I'd return with help, that I'd come back before dawn. But the Germans advanced and our line broke. Panic, smoke, shouting, everything vanished." He swallowed. "I tried. God knows I tried. But I couldn't find him again." Arthur bowed his head, voice cracking with old grief. "He died, Major, alone, because I was too slow, too wounded, too afraid." "No," the Major said, voice breaking. "No, he wouldn't have blamed you." But Arthur didn't seem to hear. "For 50 years, he continued, I carried shame. I carried the memory of a man who saved my life and never received the truth of what happened after. I told myself I'd one day face his family, tell them what he did. But I was a coward." He clenched trembling fingers into the soil. "It was only when I heard someone mention the bicycle that I knew it was time. The last thing your grandfather touched before he died." Miss Marple spoke softly. "So you came back to St. Mary Mead?" "Yes," Arthur said, quietly, ashamed. "I found the bicycle, and I brought it here, so Henry could have it again, even if only in spirit." Tears shimmered in his eyes. "I just wanted to say goodbye." Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice steady and kind like a lamp held against the darkness. "Mr. Penbury," she said, "you must listen carefully." Arthur lifted his head. "You are not responsible for Henry Collins's death. War is responsible. Chaos is responsible. He made a choice, a noble one. He saved you not because he expected help in return, but because that is who he was." Arthur blinked back tears, lips trembling. "But I promised." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "and one fulfilled promise outweighs 100 broken ones. He wanted you to live, and you did. That was the only return he ever wanted." The Major nodded fiercely, tears falling. "My grandfather saved you because he believed a good man's life was worth saving. He'd be glad to know you lived a long one, and he'd never blame you for what followed." Arthur looked at him uncertainly. "You truly think so?" The Major took the old man's hand firmly. "I know it." A long silence fell, soft, cleansing, almost sacred. Then Arthur whispered, "I came to return the bicycle. I didn't expect forgiveness." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Forgiveness isn't something you look for, Mr. Penbury. Sometimes it comes to meet you." As the sun dipped lower in the afternoon sky, the three of them stood before the old bicycle. Its steel frame was dented, its rubber tires cracked, but it remained dignified, like a veteran bowed with age. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Major, your grandfather's story is whole now, but there is something else you must do." The Major nodded. "Yes, the bicycle should not return to a shed. It should stand where its story can be honored." Arthur blinked in surprise. You would display it?" Yes, the Major said. In the village museum, with his name. And yours. Arthur's lips trembled. I don't deserve. You deserve peace, Miss Marple interrupted gently. And after 50 years, you have found the courage to seek it. The wind whispered through the yew branches above them. Arthur Penbury lowered his head and cried, not with shame, but with release. Tears of a man finally laying down the weight of memory. Miss Marple watched with quiet tenderness. War takes many lives, she murmured, and sometimes it takes the living a very long time to return. She stepped away, giving the two men space, one seeking forgiveness, the other offering it. The bicycle, leaning beside Henry Collins's gravestone, stood still and silent. But it no longer felt like a relic of tragedy. It felt like a truth finally spoken, a promise finally completed, a journey finally ended. And as Miss Marple turned toward the fading light, she knew. The past had stopped running. Chapter 6, Tracks of a Vanishing Past. The churchyard had grown quiet after Arthur Penbury's confession, the stillness settling like a blanket over the stones. The air felt softer, now no longer strained with secrets. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart beneath the yew tree, watched the two men in silence. Major Collins still sat on the grass beside Arthur, his eyes red-rimmed, but steady. Grief, gratitude, confusion, and compassion all lived together on his face like unsettled weather. Arthur Penbury, fragile as a fallen leaf, wiped his trembling hands over his coat. It was a soldier's coat mended in 3 different places, threadbare at the sleeves. The fabric held 50 years of wandering and a lifetime of unspoken memories. The man looked relieved, but also faintly lost, as though the truth he had carried for so long had been the very thing holding him upright. Now that it was spoken, he seemed smaller. I didn't come back to cause trouble, Arthur murmured, staring at the ground. I just wanted Henry to know I remembered. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice a gentle balm. Mr. Penbury, she said softly, you did not cause trouble. You honored a promise the only way you knew how. Arthur looked up at her, eyes full of fragile hope. Will people here understand? Miss Marple gave him that small, wise smile, the one that had disarmed far more stubborn men than Arthur Penbury. People understand courage more than they admit, and they understand grief even better. The Major nodded. You should stay with me tonight. You need rest, Mr. Penbury. Arthur opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple gently raised a hand. There will be no arguments. Not today. As they prepared to leave the churchyard, Miss Marple noticed something unusual near the gravestone, a small folded slip of paper, partly hidden beneath the bicycle's frame. She bent down, lifting it carefully. It was thin, old, and fragile. The ink had faded, but the handwriting, precise, strong, stood out clearly. Henry? The Major asked softly. Miss Marple opened it slowly. It was a note, a brief message, just a few words. If I do not return, give this to Collins's boy. Beneath it, a barely visible signature. A. Penbury. Miss Marple exhaled quietly. Arthur, did you write this? The old soldier blinked. I, before the retreat. I wrote it when Henry left to get water for me. I thought I'd die before he came back. The Major felt his chest tighten. But you survived. And he didn't. Arthur nodded slowly. When they took me to the field station, I tried to send the note, but I never found the right moment. And after the war, the world changed. I changed. Miss Marple studied the note carefully. You carried this all these years? Arthur swallowed. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Felt like throwing him away. The Major closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Miss Marple, always composed, spoke with gentle firmness. Major Collins, your grandfather was a brave man. But Mr. Penbury here is brave too. Not many would carry such guilt and still seek truth after half a century. Arthur's voice shook. I didn't do enough. I left him. Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. You survived, Mr. Penbury. That was the gift Henry gave you. And today you returned something he would have wanted you to deliver. The Major looked at the slip of paper again, then at the old man beside him. His voice was quiet, but resolute. You have honored him more than you know. They left the graveyard slowly, the path crunching under their feet as the late afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon. The sky glowed with warm amber light, casting long shadows across the village fields. The three figures moved like silhouettes against the fading day, Miss Marple steady and upright, Major Collins deep in thought, and Arthur Penbury leaning slightly on a stick, every step careful. As they neared the railway line, Arthur paused. Miss Marple, he said, you were right. I didn't have the strength to carry the whole bicycle at once. I brought the wheel first. Then I came back for the frame. He gestured weakly to his leg. This old wound still nags. Never healed, right? Miss Marple nodded knowingly. You lifted it, not rolled it, because rolling it would have made tracks. And you did not want to disturb anyone. Arthur looked down at his weathered hands. I knew the Major might think it was stolen. I hoped to return it before dawn. But my body, it doesn't obey the way it used to. Age rarely asks permission, Miss Marple said gently. He gave a faint smile, tired but warm. Strange, isn't it? The war taught me to run. Life taught me to disappear. But coming back here, he looked at the church spire behind them. Coming back was the hardest thing I ever did. The Major placed a steadying hand on Arthur's arm. And the right thing, Miss Marple's eyes softened. When a man walks back into his past, it is rarely for adventure. It is for truth. As they approached the railway hut again, Miss Marple slowed, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully at the disturbed dust on the wooden boards. Something new caught her attention. A faint smear near the door, brownish, uneven. She touched it lightly with her gloved finger. Rust, but mixed with something else. Major, she said softly, this is blood. Arthur stiffened. I scraped my arm when I lifted the bicycle. Didn't think it mattered. Miss Marple studied the smear carefully. No, not your blood. Fresher. The Major's eyes widened. Fresher than someone else has been here? Not someone else, Miss Marple corrected calmly. Someone following. Arthur's breath caught. Following me? Miss Marple gave him a sympathetic look. No, someone following the bicycle. The Major looked alarmed. But why? Who would care about a century-old bicycle? Miss Marple gave him a steady, quiet look. For those who know its history, Major, that bicycle is not merely an object. It is evidence of something. A deed, a sacrifice, a truth. And where truth lies, questions often follow. The Major swallowed hard. You mean we're not the only ones interested in the bicycle? Miss Marple nodded. And I believe we shall meet the other party very soon. They reached Miss Marple's cottage by early evening. Its warm glow spilled through the lace curtains, casting a gentle welcome. She ushered Arthur inside, offering him tea, a warm blanket, and the peace of her quiet sitting room. The Major stood by the fireplace, unsure, restless. Miss Marple, he said at last, are you saying the bicycle has significance beyond my grandfather's story? Miss Marple stirred a spoon gently in her tea. Yes, she replied softly, and no. She looked at the Major with deep understanding. The heart of the story lies with your grandfather and Mr. Penbury, but something else has been stirred by the bicycle's disappearance. Someone else has taken notice. Arthur looked frightened. Do you think they'll come here? Miss Marple gave him the faintest smile. My dear Mr. Penbury, St. Mary Mead may be small, but it is not a place where secrets hide easily. Whoever is following will eventually step into the light, and we shall be ready." The Major drew a deep breath. "What do we do?" Miss Marple set down her cup. "We wait, we observe, and we listen." A soft wind brushed the cottage window. The past had returned, but another truth was following close behind. And Miss Marple knew. The next visitor would reveal the missing piece. Chapter 7. The Promise Made in 1914. Night settled over St. Mary Mead with a soft, smoky blue light. The village was quiet, lamps dimmed, curtains drawn, only the occasional bark of a distant dog breaking the stillness. Inside Miss Marple's cottage, the small lamp on her writing desk glowed warmly, casting gentle shadows over the walls. Arthur Penbury sat wrapped in a blanket near the hearth. His breathing was shallow, as though the day's emotions had drained the strength from his limbs. Yet his eyes remained restless, flickering to the door whenever the wind pressed against it. Major Collins, seated across from him, watched the old man with a mixture of worry and compassion. "You're safe here," he assured softly. Arthur nodded, though his fingers tightened nervously around his stick. Miss Marple, observing them quietly, knew what Arthur feared. Not capture, not blame. Memory. For men like Arthur Penbury, the past was both a place of refuge and a battlefield. A sudden knock echoed through the quiet cottage. Arthur jerked upright. The Major stiffened. Miss Marple rose with calm grace. "Who could that be?" the Major whispered. "Someone who has been following the bicycle," Miss Marple replied softly. She opened the door. A middle-aged man stood there, hat in hand, coat dusted, boots muddy from hurried travel. His face was sharp, worn from both weather and worry. Behind him, a woman slightly younger, her eyes filled with resolve, stood holding a satchel. "Good evening," Miss Marple said evenly. The man removed his hat. "We're terribly sorry to intrude at this hour. My name is Edward Penbury. This is my sister, Mary." Arthur's breath left him in a painful gasp. Miss Marple stepped aside. "You'd better come in." Edward and Mary Penbury entered the sitting-room with hesitant steps, their eyes immediately falling upon the frail figure wrapped in the blanket. "Father," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. Arthur's head lowered, shame washing over his features. Edward crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside him. "Where have you been? Why did you disappear again?" Arthur closed his eyes. "I didn't want you caught up in my burdens." Mary knelt on Arthur's other side, tears glistening. "For 50 years you've carried them alone. You could have come to us." Arthur shook his head weakly. "No, you never knew what I failed to do." Miss Marple touched Edward's shoulder gently. "You followed your father's trail tonight?" Edward nodded, his jaw tightening. "When we found his room empty, we panicked. Mary found his coat missing, and the old note, the one addressed to Collins's son, was gone. We knew he was chasing something from the war, something he couldn't let go." Mary wiped her eyes. "We followed the drag marks, the disturbed grass, then the path toward the churchyard. We saw the bicycle, and we followed again to here." Arthur looked at them both, his eyes shimmering with guilt. "You've spent your lives trying to help me," he whispered, "and all I've given you is worry." Mary shook her head fiercely. "You gave us love." "That was enough," Edward added quietly. "We came because we feared you were dying alone." Miss Marple, standing near the hearth, felt her heart tighten. No soldier should die alone. No father either. Arthur leaned back, breathing slowly. The lamp's warm glow softened the deep lines on his face. "Edward, Mary, I brought my shame here tonight, to Henry's grave, To return something I should never have kept. The Major sat forward. Tell them, Mr. Penbury, they deserve the truth. Arthur nodded faintly. In France, he began, I was shot in the leg and left behind when the retreat sounded. Henry Collins, your grandfather, he gestured to the Major, refused to leave me. He dragged me through the mud, carried me across fields where bullets fell like rain, put me on his bicycle, and pushed until his legs shook. Mary pressed a hand to her mouth, tears pooling. Arthur continued, voice trembling. I told him to run. I begged him. But he said a life saved was a duty finished. And he pushed on until I could go no farther. He swallowed. I made him promise to leave me. To save himself. The Major's eyes widened. He promised? Arthur nodded. He said he would fetch water first, just water. Enough for me to last while he found a medic. Arthur's voice broke. He never returned. A deep silence followed. Even the wind outside seemed reluctant to intrude. Mary whispered, Father, all these years you thought you caused his death? Arthur nodded. Edward placed a steady hand on his father's shoulder. But it wasn't your fault. War took him, not you. Arthur shook his head slowly. I carried his absence like a wound. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. And yet, she said, Henry Collins made his promise knowing exactly what he was doing. Men like Henry do not blame the ones they save. She looked at Arthur with warmth. And he would be glad you lived. Glad you returned. A tear slipped down Arthur's cheek. His children leaned close, one on each side holding his hands. For the first time in decades, he allowed them to. Major Collins looked toward the bicycle frame leaning by the fireplace. Something about its aging steel glimmered in the lamplight. I don't understand one thing, he said. Why did my grandfather take only a canteen when there were 3 in the trench? Why leave everything behind? Arthur exhaled slowly. He didn't leave everything, he whispered. He hid something. What? Mary asked. Arthur gestured weakly toward the frame. In the bar under the seat, there's a compartment. Henry carved it himself. He used it to hide letters, sometimes medicine, sometimes orders. The Major stared in disbelief. He never told us. Arthur gave a faint smile. He wasn't supposed to. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Major, fetch the bicycle. Together they lifted it carefully. Miss Marple found the subtle seam beneath the seat, the almost invisible divide Henry carved decades ago. With delicate movements, she eased the hidden compartment open. Inside, a thin, weathered scrap of paper, folded, protected, untouched for 50 years. Arthur gasped. I didn't know he put it there. Miss Marple unfolded it slowly. The Major held his breath. The note was brief, written in Henry Collins's strong, hurried hand. If I do not return, know that Penbury lived. Tell his family he was brave. Arthur covered his face with both hands, shoulders shaking. Miss Marple whispered, He did not die blaming you. He died protecting your memory. The room was silent except for Arthur's trembling breaths. Mary and Edward held him close, their presence anchoring him as years of pain dissolved into tears he had never allowed himself before. The Major looked down at the scrap of paper, his grandfather's last message. It was a missing truth his family had never known. Miss Marple placed the note gently into Arthur's hands. It belongs to you, she said softly. It always did. Arthur pressed it to his heart. I wanted to honor him, he whispered. But I think he has honored me, Miss Marple smiled. That is the nature of true sacrifice. The Major knelt beside Arthur. You are part of our story now, he said quietly, and you are not alone. Arthur closed his eyes, exhaustion settling over him like a soft blanket. But this time his expression was peaceful, unburdened. Miss Marple dimmed the lamp. The night has ended, she whispered. and so has your wandering. Outside, the wind carried only one sound, the quiet release of a man finally freed from his past. Chapter 8. A Memory Returned. Dawn pushed its pale gold fingers through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage. The light spilled softly over the room across Arthur Penberry, asleep in the armchair, across the old bicycle frame resting against the wall, across the small folded note tucked carefully into Edward's coat pocket. Miss Marple had hardly slept, not from worry but from reflection. She sat at her small table with a pot of tea, her mind quietly arranging the pieces of the story as if completing embroidery. The truth was spoken, Henry's final message delivered. Arthur unburdened, the Major given the story of a grandfather he had never fully known. And yet, Miss Marple felt something still unfinished, a quiet thread tugging at her thoughts. She watched Arthur's children hovering by the doorway, whispering softly. Edward was concerned, Mary gently emotional. "He hasn't slept so peacefully in years," Mary murmured. Miss Marple nodded. "Truth is often a better blanket than wool." At that moment, Arthur stirred. His eyes opened slowly, blinking at the morning light. Mary rushed to his side. "Father, are you all right?" Arthur smiled faintly, a tired but genuine smile. "I'm lighter," he whispered, "as if I've been holding a stone," and finally set it down. The Major stepped forward. "Mr. Penberry, we want you to stay with us for as long as you like. You're not alone anymore." Arthur reached for his daughter's hand. "But I have already taken enough of your lives. I?" "No." Mary's voice was firm. "Not anymore." Miss Marple watched them with quiet warmth. Reunions, she believed, were small miracles stitched from truth and forgiveness. Yet something about the note, Henry's words, continually echoed in her mind. Tell his family he was brave. It was simple, and yet strangely deliberate. Major Collins insisted Arthur rest in his guest room for the morning. Miss Marple accompanied them to the Major's cottage, the bicycle frame carefully wrapped in cloth and carried between Edward and the Major. When they reached the house, the Major's wife, Clara, met them at the door, her expression shifting from shock to sympathy when she saw Arthur's fragile condition. "Come in, please," Clara said gently. "You must all be exhausted." Arthur settled onto a sofa near the window, the warm sunlight giving his worn features a faint glow. Clara prepared tea while the Major opened a wooden chest that held family relics, photographs, badges, letters. He placed an old album on the table. "I want you to know who Henry Collins was," he said softly. "Not only as a soldier, but as a man." Arthur leaned in, hands trembling slightly, as he turned the pages. Photographs of Henry with fellow soldiers. Henry as a young father. Henry holding the newborn Major with careful pride. Arthur's breath caught. "He was more than I imagined," the Major nodded. "He would have wanted you to hear his story." Arthur lifted a photo of Henry standing beside the very bicycle, now restored to memory. "He looked stronger than life," Arthur murmured. Miss Marple watched the Major as he spoke. She noticed his expression tighten ever so slightly, grief mingling with new understanding. "Arthur," the Major said, voice heavy, "you didn't owe us anything. You owed yourself the truth." Arthur's eyes softened. "And now I have it," he whispered, "and peace with it." The Major closed the album gently. "But there is one thing I don't understand." Miss Marple looked up with quiet interest. "What is that, Major?" "The note," he said, retrieving Henry's final message. "Henry wrote it for my father or for me. But why leave it hidden in the bicycle? Why not send it? Why not write more?" Arthur looked down. "He wrote it minutes before he left," he whispered. "He thought he would be back. He didn't think it was farewell." Miss Marple nodded. "Men in war rarely write long goodbyes. They write quickly, with urgency, with hope." but the puzzled crease still lingered on Major Collins's brow. And it lingered on Miss Marple's mind as well. Henry Collins was not a careless man. Why write a message meant for a child he had never met? Why anticipate his own death so precisely? There was more to uncover. After Arthur had been settled into the guest room with Mary attending him, Miss Marple remained in the sitting room with the bicycle frame. She traced her fingers along its cold metal, studying every dent, every scar. It leaves marks on men and on objects, some visible, some hidden. She opened the hidden compartment once more. It was empty now, but faint traces of old adhesive remained at the edges. Someone had removed something else at some point, something long ago. "Major," she said softly, "did your father ever mention receiving anything from the war? Anything from Henry?" The Major shook his head. "No, just this bicycle and a few photographs." Miss Marple hesitated a moment. "May I see the storage trunk again?" He brought it to her, a heavy wooden chest with brass hinges. Miss Marple knelt beside it, examining the corners, the bottom lining, the interior fabric. She found the clue quickly. In the upper corner, stitched beneath a torn fold of old velvet, lay a scrap of waxed canvas, barely visible. "Someone tucked something in here," she said, "a long time ago." The Major leaned in, astonished. "Do you think Henry hid more messages?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, not messages." She unfolded the canvas scrap. It appeared to be part of a torn map, a battlefield map, marked with trenches and coordinates. Arthur's voice echoed faintly from the doorway. That map, Henry had it. Said it was for safety. Never said why. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with sudden clarity. "Henry didn't hide the note because he expected to die," she said. "He hid it because he expected someone to find the bicycle. Someone who would understand the map and the truth behind it." "What truth?" the Major whispered. Miss Marple turned the canvas toward the light. "This map shows the last known position of your grandfather, and the exact location of the trench where he left Arthur." Arthur paled. "Miss Marple, why would he mark that?" "Because," she said quietly, "he wanted someone to know the real story of his final act. He wanted someone to find something left behind." The room fell silent. Miss Marple studied the coordinates on the map. Her mind worked the way it always did, following subtle patterns, arranging unspoken threads, weaving meaning where others saw only fragments. Henry Collins's note, simple as it was, now appeared to be only the first half of a truth. "What do you think he left behind?" Edward asked, perplexed. Miss Marple answered softly. "A soldier's last message is rarely only words." She pointed to a symbol on the map, faint but deliberate. A circle with a slash through it. The old king's shilling symbol, the same one carved in the railway hut. Arthur inhaled sharply. "That mark I saw at once. Henry scratched it on his pack, too." Miss Marple nodded. It meant loyalty, a vow. But in some regiments it also meant a cache, a place where something of value was buried. The Major could barely speak. "You mean—" "My grandfather buried something? Near the trench?" "Something he wanted someone, Arthur or his family, to find," Miss Marple said. "But what?" Mary asked. Miss Marple gave her a soft look. "Perhaps something that explains why Henry returned for Arthur. Or perhaps something that explains why Arthur survived." Arthur trembled. "No. He saved me. Nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes softened with sympathy. "People act for many reasons, Mr. Penbury. Duty, honor, guilt, love. But Henry marked the ground where he left you. That means his final act had deeper meaning." The room grew heavy with possibility. Miss Marple stood, her hands folded calmly. "We now understand the past," she said, "but a final piece remains hidden, and it is time to find it." Arthur looked frightened. You mean go back to France? Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, not for war. For peace. The Major looked between them. Miss Marple, are you certain? She smiled gently. Oh yes, this story has carried too many unanswered questions for 50 years. It deserves its ending. Arthur leaned back, tears gathering again, but these tears were not from fear. They were from release. Henry left something for us, he whispered, and it's time we find it. Miss Marple rested a hand on the bicycle frame. A memory has been returned. But now we must follow where the memory points. Outside the cottage, the morning light brightened the world. A new journey waited, one that would lead them back to the battlefield where everything began, and Miss Marple knew. The truth buried in 1914 was about to rise at last. Chapter 9. The Journey Back to the Battlefield. The next morning dawned gray and quiet, as if the weather itself understood the weight of the journey ahead. In Major Collins's sitting room, Arthur Penbury sat propped with pillows, his coat buttoned, but his hands trembling slightly. His children Edward and Mary stood on either side of him, steady and protective. You don't have to go all the way, Mary whispered. Arthur shook his head with weak determination. No, Henry saved me once. This is my chance, perhaps my last, to face where it happened. Miss Marple entered carrying a small leather case. Only the essentials, she said gently. No heavy burdens. We're seeking truth, not hardship. The Major approached with a folded document. The War Archives confirmed the map's coordinate region, an area near the old Messines line. The place my grandfather served. Arthur's eyes glistened. I remember flashes, mud, fog, shouting, then silence. Miss Marple placed a steady hand on his. Memories may hurt, Mr. Penbury, but truth heals. By midday, they were en route. Miss Marple, the Major, Edward, Mary, and Arthur, leaving St. Mary Mead for a coastal train that would carry them toward France. The journey was slow and thoughtful. Miss Marple sat by the window, watching fields slide past like pages from a forgotten book. As the train hummed along, the Major stared at his grandfather's map again. It feels strange, he murmured, to follow the path of a man I never met, and yet feel so close to. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is the power of unfinished stories. They wait for those who can complete them. Arthur closed his eyes, leaning back as the rhythm of the train lulled him. I pray the truth is kinder than the memories. Miss Marple knew he wasn't merely afraid of what they would find. He was afraid of what he wouldn't. They reached the outskirts of the old Belgian countryside by late afternoon. The air smelled of damp earth and distant forests. The land once torn apart by fire and iron had grown back with surprising gentleness. Rolling fields of green stretched endlessly, interrupted only by clusters of white stone crosses marking forgotten soldiers. Arthur's breath hitched as he gazed out the carriage window. So much changed, he whispered, but some things, they stay. Mary squeezed his hand. The Major unfolded the worn map, comparing its faded markings with the modern road signs. Messines Ridge, he said quietly, just ahead. Miss Marple felt that familiar tingle and instinct stirring like a thread tightening. This is where the coordinates begin, she murmured. Henry marked this place for a reason. They disembarked onto a narrow dirt road, the wind rushing past them with a low, almost reverent hum. Edward guided his father gently, making sure each step was steady. Are you sure you're well enough, Father? Arthur nodded. I walked here once in fear. I will walk it now in peace. Together, they followed the road until it met a quieter path, one half swallowed by grass, winding gently into an open field. The Major checked the map again. This is the place. The trench line was right here. Arthur looked around, eyes distant. I remember. The slope of the land, the smell of earth. Henry, he carried me this way. Miss Marple stepped forward, gaze sweeping the field, as though searching for the faintest echo of history. And then she saw it. A single wooden post weathered, almost forgotten, leaning slightly, next to a lonely copse of trees. "There," she said quietly. "The king's shilling mark." Arthur stiffened. Henry marked that. I saw him scratch it with his knife. The major's chest tightened. "This is where he left you." Mary helped Arthur sit on a fallen tree trunk. The field was silent, peaceful, but burdened with the invisible weight of memory. Miss Marple moved closer to the marked post. The carving, faded but unmistakable, matched the symbol in the hut and on the map. She pressed her hand lightly against the wood. Henry marked this place not to hide something from others, but to guide someone who would return. She knelt, brushing aside the grass. The soil felt disturbed, not recently, but in a way that spoke of an object once buried long ago. "Major, bring me the trowel from the satchel," she requested calmly. He handed it over. Miss Marple began to dig carefully. The others watched, breath held. After a few minutes, the sound changed, dull metal against something hollow. "There," she whispered. She cleared the earth. A small, rusted tin box emerged, battered, but intact. Arthur gasped, covering his mouth. "Henry's message," he whispered. "This is what he left." Mary knelt beside him, eyes wide. Miss Marple handed the box to the major. "Open it. Your grandfather intended this for you or for Arthur." The lid resisted at first, but gave way with a soft crack. Inside lay a folded letter, a small metal tag, a fragment of Henry's identification, and a single photograph. Arthur leaned forward, trembling violently. The major unfolded the letter, hands shaking. The letter was surprisingly well preserved, Henry Collins's handwriting still firm and steady. Major Collins began to read aloud, voice wavering. "If you find this, know that I did not run. I returned for Penbury because he would have done the same for me. If I fall, do not let him carry the blame." Arthur began to sob quietly. The major continued. "Tell his children, when he has them, that their father was brave. He did not abandon me. I asked him to go. He chose life, as I hoped he would." Mary clung to Arthur's arm, tears streaming. Edward covered his face with both hands. Miss Marple listened, her heart tightening. Then the major's voice softened. "I am dying with peace. War is not won by those who live or those who fall, but by those who remember." Arthur's sob grew louder. The major read the final line. "If God wills it, let the truth reach them. Let Penbury walk without shame." The silence after the letter was absolute, thick, sacred. Arthur bowed his head, shoulders shaking. He forgave me, even then, before I even blamed myself." Miss Marple knelt beside him, placing a steadying hand on his. "He did more than forgive you. He honored you." Arthur reached trembling fingers into the tin box. His hand brushed the small metal tag. He held it up. It was Henry's dog tag, scratched, worn, but clearly marked. The photograph beneath it was of Henry and Arthur Young, strong, standing beside the bicycle before the chaos of the trenches swallowed them. Arthur wept openly now. "He kept it," he whispered. "He kept our picture." Mary hugged him tightly. Edward wiped his own tears silently. The major closed the tin box gently, as if laying a loved one to rest once again. "Arthur," he said quietly, "your story and his, they're both complete now." Miss Marple stood, the wind lifting a strand of her white hair as she looked out across the fields. "This is not a battlefield anymore," she said softly. "It is a place of peace, a place where sorrow has finished its journey." Arthur breathed deeply. For the first time in 50 years, the breath came easily. He looked at the spot where Henry had carved the mark, where the tin box had slept beneath the earth. "I am going home," he whispered, "without the weight I carried here." Miss Marple smiled gently. "That, Mr. Penbury, is the truest victory any soldier can ask for." The group stood in a quiet circle bound not by war, but by truth, forgiveness, and remembrance. The wind swept softly across the field, carrying with it the final echo of a promise made in 1914, and finally fulfilled. Chapter 10. Miss Marple Walks Away. 1,000 words, divided into 5 coherent parts. Part 1. The Walk Back from Memory. The field where Henry Collins had made his final act of courage now lay behind them, bathed in late afternoon quiet. The group walked back along the gentle slope, their steps slow, not only from the long journey, but because none of them wished to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the land. Arthur Penbury seemed transformed. His gait was still shaky, his age still evident, but the tension in his shoulders, built over 50 years of grief, had dissolved. His eyes, though rimmed with tears, held a clarity that had not been there before. Mary stayed close to him, steadying him when the ground dipped unevenly. Edward matched his pace with patient calm. Major Collins walked ahead, one hand protectively against the metal box Henry had left buried for decades. Miss Marple walked at the rear, giving the others the quiet space that comes after truth is spoken. Birds flitted overhead, the faint breeze carrying the scent of distant forests. At last Arthur paused. He looked back one final time at the spot where the box had been found. "Goodbye, Henry," he whispered. "Thank you for letting me live long enough to return." Miss Marple stepped beside him. "He knew you would," she said gently. Arthur nodded. Then, with a deep, steadying breath, he turned and continued walking, not with the hesitance of a guilty man, but with the quiet strength of one who had finally made peace with his past. The journey back across the channel felt lighter. Even the ferry's gentle rocking seemed to match the rhythm of a story coming to rest. Miss Marple sat by the vessel's rail, watching the water swirl below. The Major joined her, the tin box held carefully in his lap. "Miss Marple," he said softly, "I don't know how to thank you." She smiled without turning. "I merely followed the threads, Major. You were the one who held them together." He looked down at the box. "I grew up believing my grandfather died like so many others lost in a battlefield chaos we could never understand. But now I know he died with purpose. With love, with compassion," Miss Marple nodded, "and with clarity. Few men are granted the chance to decide the meaning of their last action. Your grandfather did." Major Collins exhaled deeply. "I'm glad Arthur knows the truth. Glad his children know it. Glad the bicycle led him back to us." Miss Marple looked out over the sea. "Objects carry stories far longer than people realize." He chuckled softly. "That old bicycle, who would have thought it held so much?" "Oh, no, Major," she corrected gently. "The bicycle did not hold the meaning. The men did. The bicycle merely remembered." When they reached St. Mary Mead, the village greeted them with the same quiet charm as always: bakers sweeping steps, children skipping rope, neighbors bidding gentle afternoon hellos. Yet for the small group returning from France, everything felt subtly changed. Arthur Penbury stood at the gate of Major Collins's cottage, taking in the familiar rooftops. "It feels like I've come home twice," he murmured. Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Home is often where truth finally rests." 2 days later, the villagers gathered quietly outside the small St. Mary Mead Museum. The Major had worked day and night preparing the display. Now, beneath soft afternoon light, the restored military bicycle stood inside a glass case, cleaned, polished, but still proudly bearing every dent and mark of its life. Beside it hung Henry Collins's photograph. Arthur and Henry's trench photograph. The folded note recovered from the bicycle's secret compartment. The battlefield tin box and its contents. A brief plaque explaining the bicycle's wartime story. Miss Marple stood with her hands folded gently, admiring the quiet dignity of the display. She felt a bittersweet warmth settle over her. The bicycle was no longer a relic hidden in a shed. It was a witness, a reminder, a symbol of two men bound by courage. Arthur approached the case slowly. His hand touched the glass, not to possess the bicycle, but to honor it. "He carried me," Arthur whispered, "and now the village carries him." Mary brushed a tear away. Edward placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "He would be proud of you." Arthur shook his head softly. "No, he would be proud of the truth. That's all he ever wanted." Major Collins joined them. "I hope this helps other families see the humanity behind the stories of war. Not just battles, but friendships, sacrifices, bonds." Arthur nodded. "Yes," he said. "And the cost carried long after the guns go silent." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "Stories, Mr. Penberry, survive because people choose to remember. And today you ensured Henry will be remembered with honor." Arthur closed his eyes with quiet gratitude. That evening, as most of the village returned to their routines, Arthur and Miss Marple sat beneath the old chestnut tree outside the Major's cottage. The sky shimmered dusky blue, streaked with the first silver of the rising moon. Arthur sighed softly. "I feel different," he said, "as if a chain has broken." "But gently." Miss Marple nodded. "Guilt is heavy, Mr. Penberry, but you were carrying sorrow for a man who never asked you to." Arthur's lips trembled. "He told me to live." "I never understood why." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Because you mattered to him. Saving you gave meaning to his final hours. Perhaps he saw something in you, kindness, humility, a sort of gentleness soldiers cling to amidst the horrors of war. And he wanted that gentleness to survive." Arthur looked at her, tears threatening, but softer now. "You think that's really true?" She smiled. "I know it is." A small silence followed, peaceful, restful. Arthur's voice dropped to a whisper. "Miss Marple, thank you. For finding me before my time ran out." She shook her head. "You found yourself. I merely pointed the way." He breathed deeply. "I think I can sleep tonight, truly sleep, for the first time since 1914. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "And that, Mr. Penberry, is a victory few men ever achieve." A week later, Arthur Penberry rested, healthier in spirit than he had been in decades, prepared to leave St. Mary Mead with his children. They embraced Miss Marple with heartfelt gratitude. "You gave us back our father," Mary said. "You gave me back myself," Arthur added softly. Miss Marple simply nodded, her expression gentle. When their carriage rolled away, she stood on the lane for a moment, watching it disappear into the soft morning mist. She walked back to her cottage slowly, her steps light. Inside she placed the last remaining item, a small rusted bolt, from the bicycle, into a quiet wooden drawer. Not as evidence, but as a keepsake, a reminder. A reminder that even the smallest things can hold the loudest truths. Miss Marple sat at her writing table, gazing out the window where birds perched along the hedgerow. She whispered to herself, "Nothing truly vanishes. It merely waits for someone to listen." Outside, the village returned to its gentle rhythms. The bicycle rested in the museum, no longer silent, its story carried through the hearts of those who had learned its truth. And Miss Marple, with the quiet wisdom of a woman who understands the world deeply, smiled to herself. The mystery was solved. The past was at peace, and life, as always, moved forward. I am glad to know that you are still here. If you liked this video, please like this video and subscribe this channel.